The harbor of Tripoli lay silent under the heavy cloak of a moonless night in February 1804. The cold waters of the Mediterranean lapped quietly against the stone walls of the fortress where the Bashaw of Tripoli slept in confident security. In the center of the harbor floated a massive prize of war, which was the captured American frigate Philadelphia. She was a potent symbol of American humiliation and Tripolitan power. Slowly drifting toward this floating fortress was a small and unassuming ketch named the Intrepid. On board 74 brave souls crouched in the shadows and clutched their cutlasses and pikes with white-knuckled intensity. They were led by a young officer who was about to etch his name into history. The silence was shattered not by a cannon blast, but by the sudden rush of feet thundering across the deck of the Philadelphia. The American sailors swarmed over the rail like vengeful ghosts rising from the sea. Within minutes, the quiet night erupted into a chaotic symphony of shouting voices and clashing steel. The objective was not to recapture the ship, but to destroy it utterly. As flames began to lick up the rigging and consume the dry timber of the hull, the night sky turned a violent shade of orange. The burning of the Philadelphia would be called the most bold and daring act of the age. This event marked the explosive beginning of a new era for the young United States. Decades before this fiery night, the merchant vessels of the American colonies had sailed the Mediterranean under the protective umbrella of the British Royal Navy. The Union Jack was a shield that few pirates dared to test. However, the hard-won independence of the United States stripped away this immunity. American ships were suddenly vulnerable and exposed to the predatory states of the Barbary coast. These states included Morocco and Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli. Their corsairs roamed the seas looking for easy prey to capture and hold for ransom. The young republic found itself navigating a hostile world without a navy to defend its interests. The rulers of the Barbary states operated on a system of state-sponsored extortion that had functioned for centuries. They demanded heavy annual tributes from European powers in exchange for safe passage. Great nations like Britain and France found it cheaper to pay the bribes than to maintain a constant naval presence to fight the pirates. For a new nation like the United States, the cost was crippling. The demands for gold and jewels and naval supplies drained the treasury. The alternative was even grimmer as American sailors were captured and sold into slavery. They faced brutal conditions in the stone quarries and galleys of North Africa. News of American sailors languishing in chains caused outrage back home. Families in Boston and Philadelphia and Charleston read horrific accounts of their countrymen eating black bread and sleeping on cold stone floors. The public demanded action, but the federal government was paralyzed by a lack of funds and a philosophical aversion to standing armies. The debate raged in the halls of Congress. Some argued for continued tribute payments as the price of doing business, while others clamored for a naval force to punish the aggressors. The national honor was at stake, and the world was watching to see if the American experiment would crumble under pressure. Thomas Jefferson assumed the presidency in 1800 and won with a distinct vision for foreign policy. He had long opposed the practice of paying tribute to pirates and viewed it as a moral failing that only encouraged further demands. Jefferson believed that war was the only language the Barbary rulers understood. He famously stated that he preferred war to tribute. However, he faced a dilemma because he had also campaigned on reducing the size of the military and cutting government spending. The situation in the Mediterranean would force him to compromise his principles for the sake of national survival. The tension reached a breaking point when the Bashaw of Tripoli, named Yusuf Karamanli, decided the United States was not paying enough. He felt insulted by the delays in tribute and the perceived lack of respect from the Americans. In a dramatic gesture of defiance on May 14, 1800, soldiers of the Bashaw marched to the American consulate in Tripoli. They chopped down the flagpole bearing the stars and stripes. This act was a formal declaration of war. It was a slap in the face to the United States and a challenge that could not be ignored. President Jefferson responded by dispatching a small squadron of naval vessels to the Mediterranean. This was a significant gamble for a navy that was still in its infancy. The squadron included the frigates President in Philadelphia and Essex, along with the sloop Enterprise. Their orders were to protect American merchant ships and to blockade the port of Tripoli if necessary. The commanders were given strict instructions to act defensively, but the reality of the conflict would soon demand aggressive measures. The American flag was now flying in hostile waters, thousands of miles from home. The early years of the conflict were marked by frustration and stalemate. The American blockade was porous, and the Tripolitan corsairs were expert sailors who knew the local waters intimately. They used shallow draft vessels to slip past the heavy American frigates and continue their raids. The American commanders struggled with logistical nightmares and the difficulty of maintaining a presence so far from their supply bases. It became clear that a passive blockade would not be enough to bring the Bashaw to the negotiating table. The war required a more dynamic approach. Command of the American forces eventually fell to Commodore Edward Preble. He was a stern and disciplinarian officer from Maine who suffered from a chronic ulcer and a fiery temper. Preble was determined to instill discipline and aggression into his young officer corps. He looked at his junior officers, who were mostly in their early 20s, and famously grumbled that they were nothing but a pack of boys. However, these young men would soon prove themselves to be the most capable generation of naval leaders in American history. They would become known as Preble's Boys. Among these young officers was Stephen Decatur. Character Bible Stephen Decatur is a dashing young American naval officer with wavy dark hair and intense eyes, wearing a dark blue naval coat with gold epaulets and a white cravat holding a curved naval saber. Decatur possessed a natural charisma and a hunger for glory that made him a favorite among the crew. He understood that this war was not just about protecting trade routes, but about establishing the reputation of the United States Navy. He was eager to test his mettle against the experienced captains of the Barbary coast. His opportunity for heroism would come sooner than he expected. Disaster struck the American squadron on October 30, 1803. The frigate Philadelphia, under the command of William Bainbridge, was chasing a Tripolitan vessel near the harbor entrance. Unfamiliar with the treacherous shoals, the massive ship ran hard aground on an uncharted reef called Calliosa. The crew worked frantically to free the vessel. They threw cannons overboard and pumped out water and even cut away the foremast. But the ship remained stuck fast. Tripolitan gunboats swarmed around the helpless giant like wasps and poured fire onto the deck. Captain Bainbridge faced a terrible choice. He could fight to the last man and watch his crew be slaughtered, or he could surrender the ship. With no hope of escape and the enemy closing in, he made the painful decision to strike the colors. 307 American officers and sailors were taken prisoner. They were marched through the streets of Tripoli in triumph and thrown into the Bashaw's dungeons. The loss of the Philadelphia was a catastrophic blow to the American cause. A significant portion of the naval firepower was now in enemy hands. The Bashaw of Tripoli now possessed a powerful bargaining chip. He held hundreds of American hostages and a fully intact frigate that his men were busy refitting for their own use. The Philadelphia was anchored in the harbor under the guns of the castle. It stood as a constant reminder of American failure. Commodore Preble knew that he could not allow the pirates to use the ship against his own squadron. If the Philadelphia could not be recovered, then it had to be destroyed. He began to formulate a daring plan. Stephen Decatur volunteered to lead the mission. Character Bible Stephen Decatur is a dashing young American naval officer with wavy dark hair and intense eyes, wearing a dark blue naval coat with gold epaulets and a white cravat holding a curved naval saber. The plan involved using a captured Tripolitan ketch, which they renamed the Intrepid. The small vessel could slip into the harbor unnoticed, where a large warship would be spotted instantly. Decatur selected a crew of volunteers who understood that they were likely embarking on a suicide mission. They would have to sail into the heart of the enemy stronghold and board the ship and burn it and escape. The Intrepid set sail on a cold winter night. The men were dressed in Maltese clothing to deceive any onlookers. As they approached the Philadelphia, a guard on the frigate hailed them. The pilot of the Intrepid spoke in Arabic and claimed they were a merchant ship that had lost its anchors in a storm. He asked for permission to tie up alongside the frigate for the night. The ruse worked for a few precious moments. The Intrepid drifted closer until the vessels were touching. Then the cry of Americanos rang out from the deck of the Philadelphia. Decatur shouted the order to board. Character Bible Stephen Decatur is a dashing young American naval officer with wavy dark hair and intense eyes, wearing a dark blue naval coat with gold epaulets and a white cravat holding a curved naval saber. He and his men leaped onto the deck of the frigate with swords drawn. The Tripolitan guards were caught completely by surprise. The Americans fought with a ferocity that overwhelmed the defenders. In a short and brutal skirmish, they cleared the deck without losing a single man. They quickly set about placing combustibles in critical areas of the ship. The fires were lit and the flames spread with terrifying speed. The wood of the ship was dry and seasoned, and the fire roared through the gun deck and up the masts. Decatur and his men scrambled back aboard the Intrepid. Character Bible Stephen Decatur is a dashing young American naval officer with wavy dark hair and intense eyes, wearing a dark blue naval coat with gold epaulets and a white cravat holding a curved naval saber. They cut the lines and pushed away from the burning giant. As they pulled their oars, the cannons of the Philadelphia began to cook off from the heat and fired their balls into the town of Tripoli. The harbor batteries opened fire on the fleeing Intrepid. Cannonballs splashed in the water around the small boat, but miraculously none found their mark. The crew of the Intrepid stopped rowing for a moment to give 3 cheers as the Philadelphia was consumed by the inferno. The explosion of the magazine lit up the entire harbor and sent debris raining down on the city. The mission was a complete success. The pride of the Tripolitan Navy was at the bottom of the harbor, and American honor had been restored. While the Navy was making headlines at sea, another drama was unfolding on land. William Eaton was the American naval agent to the Barbary states. He was a former Army captain with a vision that was as bold as it was unconventional. Eaton believed that the best way to end the war was not just to bombard Tripoli, but to effect a regime change. He proposed finding the exiled brother of the Bashaw named Hamet Karamanli and placing him on the throne. Eaton argued that Hamet would be a friendly ruler who would secure peace with the United States. Jefferson gave his tacit approval to the plan, but provided little in the way of material support. Eaton traveled to Egypt to find the exiled prince. He found Hamet hiding in the interior of the country, surrounded by Mameluke warriors. Eaton used his persuasive powers to convince Hamet to join him in a march to reclaim his birthright. They assembled a motley army of about 400 men. The force included a handful of United States Marines, led by Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon, and a mix of Greek and Arab mercenaries. The objective was the city of Derna, which was the second largest city in Tripoli. To get there, the army would have to march over 500 miles across the Libyan desert. It was a journey that would test the limits of human endurance. The expedition set out in March 1805. They faced scorching heat and blinding sandstorms, and a constant shortage of water and food. The mercenaries frequently threatened mutiny and demanded more money. Eaton held the force together through sheer force of will. The march across the desert was a nightmare of logistics and diplomacy. Tensions between the Christian Americans and the Muslim mercenaries flared constantly. At one point, the Arabs refused to move further, and Eaton had to threaten to withhold their rations. The camels died of exhaustion, and the men were reduced to eating hard biscuits and rice. Yet they pressed on, driven by the promise of victory and plunder. The presence of the 7 Marines provided a steel core of discipline that kept the ragtag army from disintegrating. After weeks of grueling travel, the expedition finally arrived at the outskirts of Derna. The city was defended by a garrison of loyal Tripolitan troops and fortified with walls and cannon batteries. The governor of Derna sent a message to Eaton that simply said, "My head or yours." Eaton was undeterred. He coordinated his attack with the American naval vessels Nautilus and Hornet, which had arrived in the harbor to provide fire support. The stage was set for the first land battle of the United States on foreign soil. The attack began on April 27, 1805. The naval ships bombarded the city walls while Eaton led the ground assault. The fighting was fierce and chaotic. The mercenaries hesitated under the heavy musket fire, but the Marines charged forward. Lieutenant O'Bannon led the charge against the enemy batteries. The sight of the Marines storming the ramparts inspired the rest of the army to follow. They fought their way through the streets in hand-to-hand combat. The defenders of Derna were overwhelmed by the ferocity of the assault. O'Bannon and his Marines captured the main battery and turned the cannons on the fleeing enemy. For the first time in history, the American flag was raised in victory over a foreign fortress in the Old World. The capture of Derna was a stunning achievement. A small force of Americans and mercenaries had marched across a desert and taken a fortified city. The road to Tripoli seemed open, and the Bashaw was trembling on his throne. Back in Tripoli, the Bashaw Yusuf Karamanli was terrified. The loss of his navy and the capture of Derna made him realize that his reign was in jeopardy. He suddenly became very interested in negotiating a peace treaty. The American consul Tobias Lear seized the opportunity to end the war. A treaty was signed in June 1805. The Bashaw agreed to release the American prisoners from the Philadelphia for a ransom of $60,000. The war was effectively over. However, the peace treaty came at a bitter cost for William Eaton and Hammet Karamanli. The agreement required the United States to withdraw its support for Hammet and evacuate Derna. Eaton was furious. He felt that the government had betrayed Hammet and wasted the victory his men had fought so hard to achieve. He was forced to leave the city, and Hammet was sent back into exile. The Marines and the mercenaries were pulled out, and the American flag was lowered from the walls of Derna. Despite the controversial ending, the Barbary Wars had a profound impact on the United States. The conflict established the Navy as a permanent and essential branch of the military. It proved that the young nation was capable of projecting power across the ocean and defending its citizens. The exploits of men like Decatur and Preble and Eaton became the stuff of legend. They gave the country a new set of heroes and a sense of national pride that helped to unify the fractured states. The war also left a lasting legacy on the United States Marine Corps. The Battle of Derna is immortalized in the Marines' hymn with the line "To the shores of Tripoli." The Mameluke sword carried by Marine officers to this day is modeled after the sword presented to Lieutenant O'Bannon by Hammet Karamanli. It serves as a tangible link to the Desert March and the bravery of those few men who fought on the sands of North Africa. The peace with the Barbary states was fragile and short-lived. During the War of 1812 against Britain, the Barbary rulers saw an opportunity to resume their piracy while the American Navy was distracted. They captured more American ships and enslaved more crews. But this time the United States would not respond with tribute or lengthy negotiations. Once the war with Britain was over, a massive American squadron returned to the Mediterranean in 1815. This second conflict, known as the Second Barbary War, was swift and decisive. Stephen Decatur, now a Commodore, returned to the waters where he had made his name. Character Bible Stephen Decatur is a dashing young American naval officer with wavy dark hair and intense eyes, wearing a dark blue naval coat with gold epaulets and a white cravat, holding a curved naval saber. He captured the Grand Admiral of the Algerian fleet and dictated peace terms at the mouth of a cannon. He forced the rulers of Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli to pay indemnities to the United States and to end the practice of tribute forever. The era of state-sponsored piracy in the Mediterranean was brought to a close. The European powers who had paid tribute for centuries were shamed into action by the American example. They soon launched their own campaigns to suppress the Barbary corsairs. The United States had led the way in establishing the principle of freedom of the seas. The nation that had once been dismissed as a collection of weak colonies was now a respected maritime power. The Barbary Wars were a crucible for the early American Republic. They forced the nation to grapple with difficult questions about the use of military force and the cost of freedom. The lessons learned in the Mediterranean would shape American foreign policy for nearly a century. The idea that the United States would not submit to extortion became a core tenet of its identity. The navy that was forged in the fires of Tripoli would go on to become the dominant naval force in the world. Today, the memory of the Barbary Wars has largely faded from public consciousness. The names of Preble and Eton are known mostly to historians. Yet the echoes of those cannon blasts in Tripoli harbor still resonate. They remind us of a time when a young nation stood alone against a global threat and refused to back down. The courage of the sailors and Marines who fought in those distant waters laid the foundation for the global presence of the United States today. As the sun sets over the modern harbor of Tripoli, the ghosts of the Philadelphia and the Intrepid seem to linger in the mist. The waters are quiet now, but they once boiled with the fury of combat. The story of the Barbary Wars is a testament to the enduring spirit of those who serve. It is a story of audacity and resilience and the unwavering belief in the cause of liberty. It is the story of America's first foray into the complex and dangerous arena of international conflict.